Hi everybody, this is Ben, and this is going to be just a casual primer on how we can start to look at, investigate, and learn from consensus contouring studies. So these are just some first thoughts, really just off the cuff, and then I'm going to talk about some ways we may be analyzing. Let me preface it by saying this. I'm going to talk about some things, and as we start to have meetings, for example, with AI vendors, etc., and other opinions, a lot of ideas are going to fly into the air, and I think some of them are going to be good, and some of them we're going to prove not to be good. But whatever we do on these podcasts is partially important, but just as important is what ideas do you get? What ideas for, hey, I think we could use the data in this way, or hey, I think this would be a good experimental design. So I want you to be very active in the feedback so that we can continually improve how we start discussing consensus contours. Let's talk about why we would do consensus contouring studies in the first place. Well, first of all, if you've done any contouring studies, you've probably realized what I've realized over the past 15 or so years, and that is contours are opinions. Expert clinicians will differ in opinion given the same image set, given the same inputs. Now, that's a fact of life that we have to try to drive out and drive towards a ground truth. Are their opinions different because they're seeing the images different? Are their opinions different because they were trained differently? Are their opinions different because they think a certain type of contour will be a more conservative approach or a more aggressive approach? What we need to realize is everyone's using the same DVH objectives ultimately, so we can't have different strategies for contouring. We can't, for a given image set, say this physician's opinion A and this physician's opinion B. Even though they're very different, they're both going to give the same outcome, because ultimately the contour is the blueprint for how we're going to throw photons or electrons or protons into the body, or to do obviously brachytherapy. So it's a blueprint for how we're going to both treat tissue and spare tissue. It's extremely important, maybe one of the most important things. By doing consensus studies, we're able to kind of free ourselves from what's right and wrong, and we start to gather a bunch of opinions and see if we can use what's sometimes called the wisdom of the crowd to make some sense of it. So what a consensus study at the very surface, it's not really a determination of what is correct. It's a collection of data of opinions of people who think about this and do this for a living. So what does this enable us to do? Well, first of all, we can see inter-observer variation. First thing we want to do is focus on the regions where there is high agreement, okay? That's a great thing. You have high agreement means, or even unanimous agreement. That's very important. It kind of means, okay, that probably is correct. So then we can turn our eyes to other things, and those other things are going to be where there are regions of high disagreement, because those are the things we probably need to talk about. Why are there such varying opinions? Some people draw it much larger, some people draw it much smaller. We have to talk about why we do that if we're going to have any hope of driving out the variation. And one of the tenets of quality is to drive out variation. So at the very least, getting a bunch of data and presenting it visually in an intuitive way lets us hone in on those areas that we should be talking about, we should be negotiating, and we should be learning from. So that's exciting. Let's talk about a little bit about the potential outputs, because you might say, why do we study consensus? Let's just determine what's right and move on with it. Well, I think determining what's right is part of the challenge, and taking a lot of opinions at this stage sounds an inefficient way to do it, but it could be quite efficient, because otherwise you spend all your time arguing about who are the experts. And if you have two so-called experts that disagree wildly, it may be that neither is an expert, or one is and the other isn't, or they're both experts in different regions. And we just can't do that. We need to be a little more scientific about it. The holy grail here is to be able to take a bunch of opinions, use the wisdom of the crowd, and start to figure out, if we combine all those opinions, does it drive us to agreement more quickly? Even to the point that if we did some statistical analyses of the ISO agreement lines, do some of those surfaces really start to look like what people would agree is probably a good rendition of an organ at risk or a target? That would be pretty super, because then we could create gold standards. We would have a process to create gold standards for contouring. You could bring in an image set, do a consensus study where 50, 100, or 200 experts draw their opinion of certain organs and targets. you do these statistical analyses and you say, here are these very smooth, beautiful surfaces. Does this look pretty accurate? That gives you a really good starting point and may, in fact, get you very close to what people might agree on. Now, why do we need that? 2 reasons. One is for education, for dosimetrists, radiation oncologists, even radiologists. People who are going to be doing manual contouring will then have a gold standard to kind of compare their manual work with. But even as important in this modern day and age is we need a lot of data sets, independent, robust data sets that we use to validate auto-segmentation, in particular AI or deep learning algorithms, so that we let the software create the contours. It would be really nice if we were all validating against some data sets that we think are pretty robust. Of course, you can always validate and should probably validate your AI engines against who you think your local experts are. But sometimes if you're arguing about that, it would be really nice to say, well, let's see how this engine compares to a consensus. Even to the point that if we created this robust library of consensus contours across many, many image sets and modalities, all of the AI software developing companies would have those as standards, probably to validate their models against so that they remain independent. But it's just a really good treasure that we could start building up. All right, so let me draw a couple pictures about how we can kind of visualize variation. And this is really just to tee up all the future podcasts we'll be doing so I don't have to repeat the methods. And you know what, I think I'm gonna go old school and bring in a whiteboard. So give me a minute. All right, I know people these days get tired of looking at slides, screens. So it's just conceptual. Here's what we're really dealing with. You get a lot of observers to independently contour on the same image sets. You then accrue all those, and for each structure, you build a three-dimensional, we're gonna build a three-dimensional, what I call an ISO agreement grid. Think of it like a dose grid, but now instead of every point having a dose value of gray, it has a consensus value. What's the level of agreement? So a point of 100% agreement would mean all of the observers thought that was inside or on the structure. And a lower agreement would mean fewer people thought it was on the contour. So that produces things that look like dose distribution. So it's really easy to interpret, but I want to get us in the habit of knowing how to read these very quickly so we can hone in the discussions to make them very fertile. So let me just I'll draw a 2-dimensional structure. These things are clearly 3-dimensional. Let's say we have a structure where the consensus across, say, 100 observers, this is the 100% line. Every single voxel in there was considered part of the structure by every observer. Great. Well, as we start to then draw these gradients, it might start to look like this. And I'm just going to make up a shape for illustration. I'll use some colors. All right. Let's say we had a 2-dimensional consensus. So these are ISO agreement lines. What can we say about these regions? Region of high agreement. And in fact, let's give it a name. Region of agreement would be an ROA. So this would be a region of agreement. Anything that's 100% or near 100% would be a high region of agreement. Almost more interesting than that, though, are these gradients. Because a steep gradient here, normally we think, oh, it's a steep fall off. There's a lot of changing opinions. No, what this is probably the most important thing to look for in terms of agreement. A steep gradient on a consensus line means a region of agreement of the surface of the structure. So steep gradients like this also represent a region of agreement, and I'll call it for a surface. All right, so this would be a region of agreement for the volume or the inside of the structure. The sharp, sharp, sharp gradients are gonna drive your eyes to where people agree on the edge or the surface of the structure. So this leaves us with kind of a region that looks like this, or even a region that looks like this. This is a low gradient. This would represent a region where, say, 20% of the people thought, maybe 30%, 40, 50, etc. And then same thing over here. So this is what we really should call a region of disagreement. It shows that opinions start to differ in this area. So we know not only can quantify the differences, but we know where they are, which is important. So that's a region of disagreement, and this is a large region of region of disagreement. So when we look at this, there's something to be learned from here. There's something to be learned with these sharp gradients, and there's something to be learned from where we disagree. These are the things we can probably put in our pocket as, okay, high agreement. Occam's razor would say that's probably the edge of the edge of the structure. Region of disagreement is clearly what we need to talk about. Why do some people contour out here and some people don't? That will get experts talking. You got to talk about it out loud, and then maybe they'll say, oh, well, that's a really good method. Maybe we should start doing it that way. And if we're not talking about the disagreement, then we're not going to be driving towards agreement. So we're going to be looking at a lot of pictures that look like this, and I think our ability to hone in on those areas is going to be important. And then lastly, what I hope we can find, of course I don't know, but a hypothesis might be that let's say we really did have 1 or 2 or 3 true experts in the field, and they could convince anyone of their contouring, and they could do training. We can compare their manual contours against the population. And what if we start finding that, let's say, expert A tends to draw contours that have a high quantitative agreement with a certain ISO agreement line, let's say the 30% line. If we prove that on an organ over multiple image sets, we just discovered that instead of bothering expert A to do something, we can mimic an expert by getting a bunch of independent opinions. That enables us to have a bigger bandwidth to create standards. And I also think when you take the population consensus, you're kind of rounding out the edges, you're removing the outliers, and I think it's going to be really interesting to figure out if we convert these ISO agreement lines to contours, at a certain level of agreement, do they start to look like gold standard contours? And if we can find that or even get close to it, I think there'll be a lot of really good things we can do. So all of you, a part of any inter-observer contouring study, it's really important that you put your opinions in to help us make these discoveries. And also I think we need to be all a little bit open-minded about reserving judgment on if we know everything or if we're experts or non-experts. Let's see what the data show us, objective data, and let's just see where the discussion leads.
All right, let me break away and show a few pictures just in case what I was saying didn't make sense. Let's first go over the general process of how you do consensus studies like this. First, you have to prepare data. That means identifying and anonymizing image set or image sets, because you might study one modality versus another to see if one of them generates a higher consensus, or you may distribute fused image sets to see if that generates a higher consensus. Then you're going to define which anatomical structures you're going to study. Then you're going to distribute the data. Now, this you could do via providing some kind of download mechanism for anonymized data sets, but most, if not all, of the studies I'll be helping out with or leading will use a Prono platform, which makes it super easy to distribute the data on a cloud-based platform for visualization, contouring, etc. Then you're going to do data collection. So you give a certain amount of time for your participants to contour the structures that were required. These, again, are going to be blind, so they're not going to see what their colleagues are contouring. They'll see their copy of the data and only that copy. Once you've collected the data, you do some calculations. Pretty easy. These are done in batch calculations. I've got some software that does this real easily. You're going to calculate 3D consensus grids. So these are going to generate the things that look like dose distributions, but they are the ISO agreement grids or consensus grids. Then you can look at any number of metrics of variation so that you can kind of grade which structures show more variation than others, where are the variations, etc. Then other calculations could be comparing specific consensus ISO agreement lines either to one or more experts or to an AI-generated contour. Then finally, we want to distribute the results. So if it's on a Prono platform and you are a participant, we can generate the results like the consensus grids so that everyone can go in 24 hours, 7 days a week and look at the consensus grids on their own time. And then, of course, we'll be trying to make the discussions that we'll publish for free and for the world on a platform like YouTube. How the data are collected, obviously you've got multiple observers who have their own opinions. They draw their contours. These are then assembled together. These are all the spaghetti lines of, say, 20 different contours with their opinions of the right and left parotid glands in this case. What do you do with those? Well, now is where we calculate the consensus grid. So in a 2D, this starts to look like isodose lines. Of course, it's a 3D structure, so you're analyzing the surfaces in 3 dimensions. Metrics of variation, you want to study on a structure by structure basis, and then you can compare between structures to see if which ones are most consistent versus most variable. A very simple tool that gives you an idea would be histograms of the volumes. It's just a range of the total volumes that people contoured. That only goes so far, but it's an interesting thing to look at. Then you really want to start analyzing the isoagreement surfaces. And here we want to use the thing that we use in radiation therapy when analyzing surfaces of doses or surfaces of structures, and that would be the gradient indices. So if we looked, for example, at the ratio of the volume of a 20% agreement line versus the ratio of the volume of an 80% agreement line, that would be a single number. For a perfect consensus population, that would be a step function gradient, and this number would asymptotically approach 1. So the larger this number is, or the higher the index is, the more variation. And you can pick whatever numbers you want. It could be 75 or 25 volume of 25% agreement versus 75% agreement. It could be 10% agreement divided by 90% agreement. We don't really know what the magic numbers are, but they're super easy to calculate once you have the 3D grids. And the idea here is, again, just to generate some kind of objective metric of the variation across multiple observers. Now, when you want to compare the population versus an individual, and the individual here could be an expert or it could be an AI engine, you can do automatic studies of expert A versus all the different percent ISO agreement or consensus lines and start to look and say which of those ISO agreement lines starts to look most like the expert and how close is it. You can do the same thing, of course, with an AI engine. This is a pretty interesting thing as we start to learn what the consensus lines tell us. Of course, comparisons can be things like the Dice coefficient, confirmation number, and max difference or in distance from surface to surface in 3D. Those are the very basic ones. We also might be inventing a host of other things. And then another thing I think is interesting to look at when you're studying a population or studying one contour versus another would be, and one of the contours could be an actual contour, one could be an ISO agreement line. You can look at what percent of the voxel that are not overlapping are within 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter, 5 millimeter, 10 millimeter, etc. That's a neat thing to look at because you might have a low Dice coefficient, for example, but you might have a large number that are all within 1 or 2 or 3 millimeters. So these are the types of things we can probe. Just a little bit of review of some of those basic comparison metrics. I'm sure everybody knows this, but let's say we have surface A, again, represented here in 2 dimensions. Everything we'll be doing is in 3 dimensions. Another opinion would be surface or volume B. We want to get some kind of metric of comparison here. I'll give you 3 examples of common things. First, we need to examine that A and B are going to have some region of overlap. Now, that could be 0, but here I've represented it in purple. So here we have A and B, and then the overlap C, or let's call it common, is in purple. So if we want to calculate the Dice coefficient, it's simply 2 times C, or 2 times the intersection, divided by the sum of the volume of A and the volume of B. Confirmation is very similar, but it's a little more sensitive because it's using multiplication here. So it would be C squared divided by A times B. If you recognize this, this is essentially the confirmation number we use when we're looking at, say, the coverage of a target, and it's the intersection of an isodose line and a target volume divided by the volumes of the two, often called the Paddock number. And then, of course, we can look in what the max difference is. The max difference isn't perfect either because you may have a spike or a really small volume where the max difference is very high. So you can start to look at other differences where it's the difference of, say, 80%, 90%, 100% agreement. A lot of different things to play with, but this is the primordial soup of some of the analytics we can do quite easily once we're generating consensus data.
So that's kind of a long discussion. You only have to watch it once. The future podcast will be jumping into actual data sets, engaging with other experts about their opinions. And I hope it leads to some great things. So let's do it.